welcome. Like I said, I'm recording. Be on your best behavior. There is way too much to cover in this one class. So I'm going to pretty much hit the ground running and cover as much as I have on my list as I can, with knowing that I'm probably going to get some questions along the way. So Photoshopping with me. You get to learn how to do fun things like this. This guy also is named James, so it's very appropriate that he gets to do fun things with Photoshop when people ask him to. And then...
Ooh, that is so gross.
And then finally. So let's talk about what Photoshop is. Photoshop is a photo editor. It's really meant to take care of photographic images. What it is not meant to do is do things like logos. That's what Adobe Illustrator is meant to do. And you can see the difference between what the two are meant to do by looking on the screen here. On the left is what we call rasterized images, and those are pixel by pixel. That's what Photoshop does, and it does it really, really well. Illustrator does vector graphics, and what vector means is that it's actually, even though it looks like you've got a drawing there, it's really computer code. It's like a percentage. It's telling it that this is an exact line, and you can blow that line up as big as you want or as small as you want, and it's always going to look clear and crisp. Unlike vector with Photoshop, if you take a picture and you zoom in far enough, it's going to start to look gritty. If you make an image that's really big and make it really small, it's going to start to look bunched up together. So those are the primary differences that we have with raster and vector. We've got some common file formats that Photoshop can open: JPEGs, GIF or GIF, whichever one you don't like to call it, it's that one. PNGs, and PSD, which is the actual Photoshop format, Photoshop document. JPEGs are a flat image. They are always flat, and what I mean by that is that they can't have anything, they can't have transparency. GIFs and PNGs, on the other hand, can have transparencies, and that's important to people for different reasons. PNG is as if JPEG and GIFs had a baby, because it lets you have like the high quality that a JPEG can have, but the transparency of a GIF. And GIFs, on the other hand, have this issue with a color palette. I'll show you all that later, hopefully. With that all said, let's jump on into Photoshop. So this is the basic view of Photoshop. We are going to use Charlie Ramos again, because I like using Charlie as an example. This is the same picture I used for the button, so it just seems perfect to use it. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a bunch of different windows.
Sorry about that.
Those windows can be open and closed with these little arrows on the right. They all have different descriptions for what they do. And the two most important ones that we're going to be using today are the Layers window and the History window. If for some reason you don't see them, there's this menu button at the top called Window, and it literally has every single window imaginable ready to go. So you can see for me, I have History checked off and I have Layers checked off. That's not always true. If it's missing, find it, open it. So, with the windows, if you see right here, they've got these two little arrows. That lets you make those windows bigger and smaller. Sometimes screen real estate's very important depending upon the document that you're working on. You can also resize the windows and take the windows out and move them around. Close them out. And then this is our history that I talked about. So with the history, anything that we do shows up in the history. So if I make a selection, you'll see it says history happened. If I use the next tool and moved it around, it says it moved the selection. If I draw on Charlie, which let me draw a little mustache, not that that really does a whole lot of good for Charlie. Too small to see. I'll show you why it's too small to see in a second. But you can see every single time that I have made some change, it's adding to my history. And if I click back in the history, it undoes those changes all the way up to that point. So I can go back and forth. Now, if I go back and then I make another change. So let's say I go and add an eraser tool and start to do things out. I have now overwritten all of my things that I undid. Or as I like to say, you can undo what you did back numerous steps, but once you overdo what you undid, well, you done did it. As for layers, layers are a super, super important aspect of Photoshop. If I have a bunch of layers, let me add this copier image in here. Not there. Open with Photoshop. Let me pull these layers up here so you can see them a little easier. So I now have a bunch of different layers, and the layers are stacking on top of one another. It's an order. So if I have any image in Photoshop as a layer, it's going to sit on top of anything else that's below it. So what I mean by that, I have all these images. So I have Lower School Library, and Lower School Library is on top of or underneath Lower School Lounge. So if I take Lower School Lounge and move it over the library, it's above it. If I take both of these and move it above it, you can see that it sits above it. I can also move the layers though. So if I take the lounge and move it underneath the library, now library is on top. So very basic concept. It's like literally taking a sheet of paper and having something on top of it. But if I pick that thing and put it underneath it, now it's underneath it. Back to Charlie. We're going to make Charlie a duplicate layer. I'll show you why here in a minute. All right. So with the layer, you can see a bunch of different properties in here. This can make your different layers have some very quick adjustments that make them look brighter, darker, but here we have opacity. And this one's really important because it can take your layers and let you start blending them with one another. So if we had another image behind Charlie, and we start bringing the opacity down, then you can see the thing showing up behind it. How do I get what to pop up?
What you're doing right now, I don't see that. It's on the layer.
The opacity right here?
No, I don't see the layers top like that.
So that's in the Windows options that I talked about. If it's not showing it for you, so under Windows, and then about halfway down, you can see it right here, layers. There's also a shortcut, F7. Yeah, so all these windows, so the problem that she had was that it wasn't where it was on my screen, and that's because it put it somewhere else on her window. Photoshop is going to pick some place that it thinks it belongs, and then it lets you move it around from there. So you can have as many windows as you want open, and they can be in all sorts of different places. All right. So one of the things whenever I brought this button over into Charlie was that it looks a little funny. I'll show you why in a second. I'm going to fix one thing about Charlie real fast, though. This picture of Charlie is huge. That's because Wally took a really high quality image, and so we can like zoom in on it and do lots of really cool things. And that's good if we want to make some microscopic changes. But when we're trying to work with other images with one another, it can do really weird things. Like that button I brought in looked really, really small because by comparison it was. And we can see that by down here. The Charlie that we're looking at is actually only 16% of how big this image actually is. If we zoomed in on Charlie all the way, this is what the picture is at 101%. So that's a little too much. Under the menu where it says image, you can go to image size, and image size will let us change the image that we're working with. And by default, it gives us this little option where our width and our height are linked together. So no matter what I make the width, the height will adjust with it automatically and keep the dimensions. If you don't want that, you can always break it. But when you break it, funny things happen. So now Charlie looks a little wackadoodle. So generally, you probably want to keep that option on there. The other thing is it lets you choose by percentage. Maybe we want to make Charlie a 10% of what the size it was. So if we put it on percent and I change it to 10, now it's 10%. And now this is Charlie at 100% in this image. So that's a little bit better for what we're doing because I don't have any other images that are that huge. But now, y'all saw earlier when I was using that pencil tool, that pencil tool is going to look a lot bigger now. That's because before, the pencil tool was writing on a Charlie that was umpteen billion sizes larger than the pencil. So the pencil didn't look like it was doing anything. Now, let's clean Charlie back up using my history. And back to what I was talking about with the smart objects. So the Ramos button, famous Ramos button, has this little symbol on it when I pulled the picture in. When you pull pictures in on top of other pictures, it makes them as a smart object. Smart objects are cool, but we can't alter them until we rasterize them. So remember how before I talked about vector graphics versus raster graphics? This is treating it like a vector graphic, even though it really isn't. So if we right-click on it, there's this option that says rasterize layer. That lets me start doing whatever I want with the button. So when you pull images on top of images, you're going to see that, and you just need to know that you need to fix it. Photoshop didn't always used to do that. I don't know why they changed it, but it's one of those things you just have to remember. More fun things with layers. We can duplicate layers. So if I right-click on the layer, it's one of the options right there, duplicate. It lets me rename it to whatever I want. So now I can have multiple Charlie buttons, and I can move those buttons around. Can be a little fun. This guy, let me close Charlie out and open him back up so that you can see another important thing. When you first open an image in Photoshop, it's going to have this background. So where it says background, and it has this lock icon. That lock icon is telling me I can't change this image because it's locked in place. I've never understood why Photoshop wants to do that, but if I duplicate the layer, it's now a layer that I can edit. So see how there's no lock there anymore? Now I can start messing with it. Generally, whenever I make an image, I just use this eye icon right here. Now it's hidden. You don't see any difference because Charlie is already on top of himself. But let's make Charlie small again. Or I should say, let's make Charlie normal size again. And I'm going to pull out my eraser. Now if I bring Charlie's background image back, he looks back to normal. That's because we're working with those two different layers. So once I duplicate my background, I sometimes even just delete it, but I'll usually just hide it because I don't want to make edits to Charlie and not see my edits because of a weird background issue. And then the other thing that we can do, and y'all saw it briefly in the other image that I had up, are folders. So you can take multiple images and group them into a single folder. And so that option is group from layers. So they stopped calling them folders and they started calling it groups. Okay. But now this is a single folder that I can hide and bring up at will. That's great, especially if you've been taking multiple images that kind of belong together and you group them all into one thing. And then you can move them all together, or you can hide or unhide them together. But it's been super useful for a lot of the things that I do. All right. One of the things that I showed y'all was opening an image. Just want to show y'all that there's a lot of like other programs. I can drag and drop anything into here to open it. There's also a file open menu. Like many other things, there are a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, which can make your life a lot better and faster if you use Photoshop a lot. And then also, if you right-click on your desktop, you can open with Photoshop. So 3 different ways that you can open anything into Photoshop. If you go to pull something into Photoshop while you have an image up, it assumes you want to put it on that image. So that's back to that button. If I pull the button over, it's now adding it to this image. It's not making it its own image. Guess what I need to do? Make Charlie small again. So now when I bring that button in, it looks a lot bigger. That's because the button is more appropriately sized to Charlie. You can tell that this looks like a smart image because of all this X on it and these different pieces. We can make it whatever size we want right off the bat. And once I check off on it, then we see that little image I talked about before. So I'm going to go ahead and rasterize that for later and then hide it for later. Okay, so now we are going to go through a bunch of our different toolbars. And the toolbars are on the left. These are where you're going to be spending most of your time in Photoshop, is going through these different options. Let's pull this over. Our first option is the move option. If I hover over any single one of these tools, it tells me what it is. It even shows me some examples of what it does, and then it also tells me a keyboard shortcut for selecting it. So with my keyboard, if I click V from any other tool, it immediately selects this move tool for me. And the move tool does exactly what it sounds like. It lets you move things around. The next option are the select tools. So zoom in for that. See in the bottom right, that little arrow? That means that this has multiple tools bundled in with this tool. If I hold down this select tool, it shows me that there's a rectangle marquee and an elliptical marquee. So if I do elliptical, it lets me do a circle selection. The rectangular marquee is a rectangle. Easy enough. Next on our list is the lasso. The lasso tool is kind of like our selection tool, except it lets us do a custom selection. So instead of a square or a circle, a non-defined shape. There's also a polygonal lasso tool. So if we were doing more hardline edges, you can now do that too. These selections allow us to manipulate whatever's in the selection. So now that I have this selected, if I use the move tool, see how it turned into a pair of scissors? What it's telling me is I can move around that. So that becomes very, very powerful very, very quickly. But now we're going to get to one of the things that a lot of you are going to really, really love very quickly. Let's hide him. Make Charlie a little bit larger. This tool is the magic wand tool. The magic wand tool, when you select an area of your picture, it attempts to select everything that it thinks kind of matches that selection. So I'm going to pick the background. Oh, sorry, still have the button. Let me duplicate Charlie because he's not a background. So see how it's picking up on all these different background images? There's this option up here, and every single tool that we have has these different options of some respect or form. Tolerance is the one that lets us say, how selective do we want the magic wand to be? So if I change the tolerance to being something higher, it now does a much better job at selecting more of the background. Back to the quick select tool real quick. So if you want to select more than one thing, you can hold down the Shift key. And when I hold down the Shift key, you see that little plus sign pops up on my cursor? That now lets me add to my selection, which is really good if you don't want to get all of Charlie. You just want to get like his head and maybe just his shoulders. So we could do just his shoulders right here. Likewise, if you hold down Alt, the Alt key, it lets us take away from it. So I can now take away from some of this selection. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because with that Magic Select tool, we can do the same thing. So it selected some area, but it didn't select all the stuff I wanted it to select. If I hold down Shift, like before, the plus icon pops up saying, oh, you can select this plus something else. So now I'm selecting all these different areas. But look what it did. Charlie's shirt was blue, just enough with the rest of the background that my Magic Select tool picked up on it too. So it's not perfect by any means. But if I went back to my lasso tool and I hold down the Alt key so I could deselect some stuff, I could then get rid of that. And now we have mostly just Charlie selected. Or really mostly just Charlie's background selected. And then I could delete it. So this is what a lot of people have asked for, the ability to remove backgrounds, the ability to take people and add them to other backgrounds. That is a good way to do it. However, Photoshop has done something really amazing. If you hold down the Magic Wand tool, they now have a quick select tool. And with that quick select tool, I can now quickly select Charlie. Just like that. Now, it still picks up on a few little things, but this is much easier to go into and custom take out than the way it used to be in Photoshop back in the day. So now that I have Charlie selected, I could delete Charlie if I just want the background, but we probably want Charlie. In our menu at the top, where it says Select, they have an option called Select Inverse, which basically says, okay, take anything that you have and reverse it. So if I select the reverse, now Charlie's not selected, everything else is selected. So I can go back to deleting that background again. So very quick ways that you can select somebody. Where it goes wrong is if the person you're trying to select is too much of the same color as the background that they're on top of. Magic Select tool can't do a good job if it doesn't have hard edges to work off of. So that's where you're going to run into problems. This tool is a 3D dropper tool outside the scope of what we're doing. So just ignore it. This pencil icon lets us have brush tools and pencil tools. Similar to the other things that we've had here at the top, we can change the different options about the brush tool so I can make it a lot bigger. Now, if y'all see what happened here, when I went to use the brush tool, it didn't brush on top of Charlie. That's because I still have everything but Charlie selected. If I were to undo that selection, now I can draw on top of Charlie. So what you have selected is what you're working with, and anything outside of that, you're not allowed to mess with it. Next is a clone stamp tool. This clone stamp tool lets you do some really interesting things. So I don't know if y'all can see that very well. There, I can see a little better. They're taking different little aspects of that plant and adding all around it. We're going to try it with Charlie's face and probably expect to see some really weird results. So in order to do that, you have to hold down the Alt key. And when you do, see how the cursor changes into like a target? We'll pick Charlie's nose as the target. And now we see Charlie's nose. So now we can pull Charlie up all over the place. So, neat stuff, right? The eraser tool, it's exactly what you think. It lets us erase images. But then there's this background eraser tool. And the background eraser tool doesn't look like it does a whole lot different. But when it really matters is if you're messing with a background itself. Then we can get rid of just the background. If you don't use the background eraser and you use just a regular eraser, it replaces it with this image, this color right here. See where it says set background color? Regular eraser erases it to a background color. Most people probably don't expect that. If you don't have the background selected, then it's just going to erase it like normal. So back to this Charlie with a regular eraser tool, nothing behind it, no background, just deletes it. Back to background Charlie, and we try to erase something. Now it's replacing it with that color. Again, I don't usually mess with the background because it's so limited and does really weird things. I like to make the duplicates of it and start using my own version, not the background locked version. On the left is a 3D material drop tool. If you've paid attention to the 3D dropper tool and we're saying ignore it, we're doing the same thing for this paint bucket in the 3D mode. This is the one that a lot of people are going to want to know about. It is the character tool. And so with the character tool, we can highlight an area and we can start typing. And this also brings me to the next window that you'll probably use a decent bit. We can change our options for the characters in the top menu bar. Depending upon which font we have selected, we can have multiple options with italics or bold italics. A few sharp, crisp, strong, center, alignments. This warp text will allow us to arc it. And they have lots of different options for that. And when you're happy with what you've done, you need to click this little check. Otherwise, it's not really, hasn't done anything yet. Once we hit the check, now it makes a new layer. So you can see our Charlie layer right here. And we can still do other things to the text though. So let's say Charlie, he's the man. And we hit that check again. Now, under Windows, this is the other window I wanted to bring up. They have this one called Character, and then they have Paragraph. Those let us do a lot of little extra things to these words. So we zoom in on that, and under the character, let's go ahead and select all of our text. This will make it to where two different sets of characters can be bigger or smaller in relation to their height to one another. So if you want the words to be closer or further apart. Then there's also making the letters themselves closer to left or right of one another, so you can make them further together or further apart. This isn't changing the actual size of the letters, it's just changing how close or far apart they are from one another. And then some of the color options that you saw. And then with paragraph, these are additional alignment options that you don't have at the top menu. Things that you don't see, like how far over from the left margin do you want it to be, or from the right. So if you end up doing any kind of like text on top of pictures, these are going to be important for you. The pen tool is a really weird tool. I don't know how much you're going to use it, but I'll show it to you real fast. So it does all these really weird, wacky things, but when I go to selection and I hit OK, it gives us some very like wavy selections. This is more of a tool that gets used in Illustrator when you're trying to make very specific curves to select around something. So I don't know how much you'll find that useful, but it is there. And if you set the pen and you do the different things with it, the option to the right of it is the Path Select tool, and that lets you alter all these little different aspects of the pen. So just in case you need that ever. Let me get off of my selections. This option right here is the line tool. It also has different shapes. So if I want to make a rectangle over Charlie's face, then I can. Let me zoom back out. Again, at the top menu, there's a lot of different options where we can change the different colors. They have this thing called stroke that puts an actual line around the border of the box. They also have gradient options, and gradients are really fun. So you can see this gradient stroke that I added, and we can also add a gradient in the middle of the box. So quick options there. And then this magnifying tool, which lets us zoom in and zoom out. There's some really nifty shortcuts for zooming in and out. I've been using it with my mouse. If you hold down Alt and mouse wheel, it lets you go up and down. If you hold down Shift and mouse wheel, it scrolls up and down the image. And if you hold Control and mouse, it goes left and right. If you start doing a lot of editing in Photoshop, that is so much faster than going and selecting the magnifying glass and zooming in or out. If you do use the magnifying glass, it's also similar to before. If you hold down the Alt key, that's when it changes it to be a zoom out or zoom in. So by default, it zooms in. Hold down Alt, it lets us zoom out. And then here's every other single tool in the box that they're not showing us, because there's a ton of them. Over the years, they've added some tools and took away others. So for anyone that's used Photoshop in the past and you think something's missing, it's probably in that area. If there is any particular tool that you like, though, if you go to Edit menu and down to Toolbar, it lets us add and remove all those different tools at our disposal. So some folks asked about crop. There crop is. I don't know why they took crop out, because crop seems like a very important one. But I'm going to show you some of my favorite tools that I don't know why they took out. So magnetic lasso. We're going to grab this whole spot healing option.
Is it weird that my options are different than yours? Because I already had crop tool and magnetic whatever.
It's not weird. Like the fact that something might have been taken out for some reason, it's not out of the realm of possibility. when you do these options, Photoshop tries to save them between your sessions. So if I close Charlie out and open Charlie back up, all of the things that I had already changed are going to be there again. So it is entirely possible that this is my fault and I removed the crop tool at some point. I don't know why I would do that because I like crop, but it is possible. So that's been adding and removing things to our box, and now I have extra tools at my disposal.
I'm sorry, how did you add them again to your box?
If you go to Edit, and then Toolbar, which is the second to last option, and it puts them in the order that you had it on the left side. So top to bottom, same thing with the little toolbox. Crop works exactly like you expect. If you highlight an area, it'll crop it down to just that. This is looking a lot like an album cover. We're getting there. Don't you worry, Charlie. We're going to get you the best music cover ever. Let's try this again. All right. Do y'all think he's going to get sick of me using him? If you hold down Shift when you're selecting layers, it lets you select multiple layers. If you hold down Control, it lets you select individual layers and add them together. So you can see how these are highlighted now that I held down Shift and Control. And now I can alter both those layers at the same time. What in the world? There we go. All right. Some folks were asking about how to do some like lighting adjustments. A lot of that is in this image option up here where it says image and then you go to adjustments. And these are all of the different things that can take your Instagram photo game up to a new level. So if we go to brightness and contrast, we can bring the brightness up or down. Let me show you what that looks like without a rectangle over Charlie's face. So brightness and contrast options. Levels are another kind of version of that. You can bring out the mid-range colors, the highlights, or the lows, and control how much of these output levels that they have.
Who has time to do all this to a picture?
Wally. So once you know a certain set of things that you're doing to a bunch of photos, they have things called batch jobs that you can do, where it takes every action that you've done and just repeats it on a group of images. So that's where, like, you know, talking like photographer level stuff where you are really trying to automate your process. So it takes a little bit of effort to affect one photo, and then you batch job that against the rest, and now your job is done for you just about. They also have vibrance, hue saturation, and color balance, all more things that are people talking about affecting lighting. So if we go into color balance and we want to bring out the reds of Charlie, we can make Charlie more red, or we can make Charlie more green, yellow, and blue, so on. And depending upon what you want to do, this stuff gets really important. When I've tried to take someone from one picture and put them in another picture, they don't look right because the lighting was different. All of these options are what help fix that and make them look more natural. Just make sure there's no other super important ones of note. I don't see them. There are some image rotation things, so we can flip them around. A lot of times people also want to flip horizontally and flip vertically. So what that looks like, flip horizontally. So the mirror problem, right? When you take a selfie in the mirror, well, now everything's flipped. So if you want to flip it back and make it look normal, you can.
Great for making your own t-shirts.
Making your own t-shirts. There you go. Another thing that I wanted to show y'all is back to our layers. And if you right click at the very top, there's something called blending options. And blending options give us a whole set of things that we can really do some fun things. Let me get this out the way. Bring this over so I stop hitting that. So we can add bevels and we can add drop shadows and outer glows and different things like that, which can really make stuff stand out for us. So if I zoom in so that y'all can see this a little easier. And I go to the blending option on these letters. Now I can bevel them so that they make them stand out very quickly. And I can make that bevel bigger or smaller. And similar to what you just said, Mary Lee, who has time for this? Well, depends on what you want to do.
I take 1,000 pictures at a time. I don't have to go through every single one and do that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't either. Not every single one. But when you have that one image that you need to make look really good, Photoshop's got you covered. Drop shadows are super, super awesome for making things like words stand out, especially if they're on top of some kind of background. So that is a tool you should definitely look at when you're trying to make your words stand out off the page. They make them pop. Drop shadow. Similar note, pretty much any PowerPoint software or Google Slides also have drop shadows, which are really good for making your presentations pop too. So just throwing that out there. All right, guess what? Only two more things that I wanted to show you. One is the color selector down here. So you see these this black box and this gray box. This is where we can now go and select our different colors. So if we wanted to change a color for our brushes, our words, everything else, we can select it here. And if we go across our spectrum, we can see the color change to different hues of red. And if we grab hold of this line right here, we can change to the different colors that we want. See my cursor change as I bring it over to the actual image? It turns into an eyedropper. That will actually pick the color that the eyedropper is on. So if you need to match colors, that's the way to go. And for any of the nerdy type people that might be watching this later down the line, this is the hex code that can be used for websites. So if you are using a website and they want the hex code, that's it. But it also gives you the RGB or Roy G. Biv and the CMYK for printing. So if they're like very specific colors that you're trying to match, then that's where you can do it. So a very good example are the branding style guides that Megan has shared. Our school colors are listed in there in these different versions, the Roy G. Biv, the CMYK, and the web color code. So if you're trying to match our colors perfectly for any purpose, you can get them, add them into this section down here, and then it'll pick our blue or pick our red. The last thing I wanted to show you, which is sometimes very useful and sometimes just gratuitous, is this filter option. So in the menu, filter, and then we have a whole bunch of options down here. So we are going to, flame? That's new. A selected path is required. All right, so that's probably not going to work. That's okay. I'll figure that out later. So I picked something called a Gaussian blur. So I can make Charlie super blurry. I can also make Charlie look like an oil painting. Like I said, gratuitous, but sometimes very useful. So there's tons and tons of those filter options. And there are also additional plugins that you can get for Photoshop to expand on what those filters can do. And that is about it as far as a crash course and the different things that Photoshop can do. One person asked about HTML and CSS, so I'll just talk about that real quick for the recording in case they watch later. There is a slice tool, we're just not going to go into detail about it, that can kind of help you lay out a website using Photoshop. And then when you export the slice tool into web code, then you can import that into something else like Dreamweaver and start working on it as a website. But that's no replacement for knowing how to do a website. You still need to know HTML, you still need to know CSS. It's not, Photoshop is not going to be your one-stop shop to make a website. So for whoever asked that question, that is now answered. All right, so speaking of questions, I know I covered a lot of ground. Was there anything that y'all saw that you were like, how can I do this? How can I do that? One question.
when you import and export things,
Yes.
you have a picture from your desktop, right?
Yes.
And so what if you wanted to grab something from the web?
So from
Drop and drag in Photoshop, or you have to export it, or?
Yeah, I'll show you. So the question was, if you wanted to get a picture from the web and pull it into Photoshop, how would you do it? And really the answer is that you download the picture from the web first and then save it somewhere on your computer and then pull that into Photoshop. So if I just do like a quick image search for, puppies. Who doesn't like puppies, right? Unless you're allergic, in which case I understand. And so I save image as, and I pick my desktop because that's easy, and I'll rename it to puppies so it's easy to find. And so now we have puppies on my desktop. And so I can pull the image over into Photoshop like I've been doing. Or I can also do File, Import. Oh, no, I can't. They changed that too. Interesting. Okay. So either I can pull it in over there, or I can hit File, Open, and it opens as its own file. And as you can see, you can have multiple files up here. If you grab the window and move it, now you can have kind of like two images up at once. If you click on the different images, you'll see all those options change on the right. So like any of your history is for that image, any of your layers is for that image. And so as you go back and forth, you'll see those options change. And as far as exporting, if you just do a file save as, and this is a good example for a save as. Let me pull our rectangle back up because I like it. So we can do export, which gives us all those options, or I can just do save as. And when you do save as, they have this menu to select the different options for the different file formats. So it really just becomes a question of what you want. If I were to do this as a JPEG, it would make this a flat image like I talked about. It would get rid of any transparency there was. It would just add some background color to it and go about its day. So if I want to keep the transparency, I need to pick something like PNG or GIF. So after I save it, gives me some options. They usually have some quality options. For the most part, I can't imagine why you want to reduce the quality unless you're talking about website stuff, which most of us won't be. So I would just leave the quality options up as high as they go. And now that that's done, so I have Charlie Ramos here, we can actually see that there's some transparency on it. But that's pretty useful if we come into like my Google Slides and I need that transparency to be on top of something so that other things show up behind it. So that's where transparency becomes very useful. So
if you wanted to make a photo of the puppy, then do you drop it more into InDesign, or can you make like
yes. If you want to do a booklet, InDesign is the way to go. What Photoshop would be used for is making that puppy look really awesome first, or like superimposing a kitten on top of the puppy or whatever else. And then you take that image and pull it into InDesign and have that as part of your overall booklet. InDesign coming later. Okay. Any other questions? I'm all ears. All two of them. Okay. Well, thank y'all very much. I hope y'all found this useful. And this video will be up later so y'all can view it. And thanks.